Good news, everyone. It's Friday. Hankinson, are you excited it's Friday? You seem very excited. Today we got a 4-question warm-up. We are on section 8.1 in your textbook on uh, solving algebraic equations, one-step algebraic equations with fractional coefficients and decimal coefficients. And we have 4 questions to warm up here. The first one is actually just a true-false. It says 3/4 of x is equal to 3x divided by 4. The answer for this question is true. Now, what I would like you to do is I would like you to write down why it's true. Here's what I want you to think about. I want you to think about 3/4 x means 3/4 multiplied by x. That's what coefficients of 3/4 means. It means you're multiplying the variable by 3/4. And if we think of x like all whole numbers as fractions over 1, then when we multiply that out, we would actually have 3 times x, which is 3x, and 4 times 1, which is 4. So therefore, we can write fractional coefficients like that. So for example, if I gave you 5/8 x, we could then think of it as being 5/8 multiplied by x, which would therefore also be equivalent to 5x divided by 8. Okay, I want you to keep that in mind because it is a fairly important academic outcome to realize that those two things are the same thing, and that this thing here and this thing here are the same thing as well. In our second question, we have 0.2x is equal to x over 5. Is that true or false? The answer for this one is true as well. And here's why. If we go backwards from here, if we think about this question and go backwards to get to this question, but think of it in terms of this. So x over 5 is really x over 1 multiplied by 1 over 5, if we think about it, which means essentially x over 5 is the same thing as saying 1/5 of x, right? So if I know that this here is the same thing as saying 1/5 of x, then when I then look at this coefficient, which is no longer a fraction but rather a decimal, I need to ask myself, what is 1/5 as a decimal? And 1/5 as a decimal is 2/10, right? So, and if you didn't know that, you could take your calculator and go, what's 1 divided by 5 if you're not one of those people, and you know that it's 2/10 as well. So the answer is true. 2/10 of x is the same thing as 1/5 of x, because 2/10 and 1/5 are equivalent fractions. All right, that's a little warm up with just the numeric side of algebra, the vocabulary side, or the understanding of numbers. If we look at the next 2 questions, they're actually isolating variables. Here we have that new one that we talked about before, where we have our variable in our denominator. So our first step here is going to be to multiply both sides by x to end up with this equation, because I multiplied both sides by the variable or by the number x. Divide both sides by the coefficient of 1.2 or negative 1.2. Grab your calculator. 4 divided by 1.2 is equal to 3.3 repeating. So therefore, x is equal to 3.3 repeating. Notice where the bar notation goes. It goes above the last 3, not above the first 3, because that 3 repeats to infinity. So therefore, x is equal to 3.3 repeating. Or if you want to get real fancy, if you're really intelligent and you want to change that from a decimal to a fraction, you could say it's equal to 3 1/3, right? If you wanted to make that a fraction instead of a repeating decimal. And our last question, fractional coefficients. We're going to divide both sides by 1.5. Because we know multiplying by 1.5 and dividing by 1.5 are opposite operations. We're going to then think of this as being an improper fraction. So negative 2 3/4 is really negative 11/4. Divided by 1.5 is 3/2. Our rule when we're dividing fractions is keep the first fraction, change to multiplication by the reciprocal. And therefore, our answer is going to be negative 22/12, which is going to be equal to negative 1 8/12, which is going to be equal to negative 1, and we divide both by 4, 2/3. Negative 1 and 2/3.